Usually when we talk about human identity or just the nature of consciousness, there is this underlying expectation of precision.
Right, yeah. We want it to be solid.
Exactly. We want it to be a solid object. You wake up, you look in the mirror, you see your face, and your brain just sort of points to that reflection and says, there I am.
Yeah.
Like, that is what I am. I am a fixed, stable entity just moving through the world. Because, it's comforting to think of ourselves as something with the defined essence.
Oh, it is incredibly comforting. We have this fundamental psychological craving for things to be visible, to have an essence we can pin down, categorize, and just rely on.
Right.
If we are a thing, then we are safe from the unpredictability of absolute change.
But then you step into the world of existentialism, and suddenly that comforting mirror just totally shatters.
It really does.
We start looking at a landscape of the self that isn't solid at all. In fact, it is defined by empty space. It's defined entirely by what isn't there.
Which is a terrifying pivot for most people. We are dealing with an architecture of existence built entirely around a void.
Boy.
Which is the absolute definition of a philosophical black hole. We aren't something. Fundamentally, we are a nothingness.
And that void, that nothingness, is exactly what we are exploring today in this deep dive.
I'm very excited for this one.
We are taking you straight into the heart of Jean-Paul Sartre's monumental 1943 work, Being and Nothingness, an essay on phenomenological ontology.
It is a massive undertaking.
It really is. So the mission here today is to decode this 700-page philosophical behemoth that essentially birthed modern existentialism.
Yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover.
We do. We're going to navigate this really dense, sometimes completely overwhelming forest of Sartre's thought. We're pulling from a huge stack of sources today: scholarly articles by Yue Zheng, Eric Tremo, Stephen Wang, Luna Dolezal, King-Ho Loom, among others.
There's really fantastic analysis in those papers.
Absolutely. Plus, translated excerpts and critical reviews of the text itself. We're going to figure out why human consciousness is essentially a whole in being, why true freedom is completely terrifying instead of liberating, and why Sartre ultimately concluded that man is a useless passion.
Which is just a devastating quote.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because we really need to move beyond the cultural caricature of existentialism.
Please.
The one, people wearing black turtlenecks, smoking incessantly in Parisian cafes.
Looking deeply depressed about the meaning of life.
Exactly. We need to get underneath that to the rigorous, radical ontology that actually drives it.
It is essential to strip away that cafe caricature. Existentialism did become a massive cultural phenomenon. Yeah. It was a sort of aesthetic mood after the Second World War.
Right.
But before we can even begin to understand what Sartre wrote in Being and Nothingness, we have to understand the historical crucible in which this specific book was forged.
The context is everything here.
It really is. It was published in 1943.
Right in the middle of the Second World War. Paris is under German occupation.
Precisely. This isn't a book written in some, vacuum of leisurely academic debate. It emerged from a moment of supreme crisis.
Yeah.
There's physical constraint, profound national and personal trauma. There are curfews, there are military patrols on the streets, severe rationing.
Just constant fear.
Constant looming threat of arrest or death.
Which creates a staggering contrast, right?
Yeah.
Because he is writing a 700-page treatise on the concept of absolute, inescapable human freedom.
While living under literal military dictatorship.
Exactly.
And that contrast is exactly why the philosophy looks the way it does. When your physical movements are entirely constrained, when the external world is locked down, the nature of internal freedom becomes hyper-focused.
That makes total sense.
But to get to his concept of freedom, we have to start with his foundational philosophical goal. Sartre wanted to completely destroy traditional dualisms.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener. When we say dualism here, we're talking about the split between what something looks like and what it actually is, right?
Yes.
Like, for centuries, philosophers, especially someone like Immanuel Kant, they separated the appearance of a thing from its hidden essence.
Exactly. Kant's phenomena and noumena. Kant argued that we can only ever know the phenomena, which is how things appear to our human senses and our human minds.
Right.
But behind that appearance is the noumena, the thing in itself, the true essence of reality. And Kant says that is permanently hidden from us. We can never access it because we are trapped behind the filter of our own perception.
So it's like reality is wearing a mask and we can only ever study the mask.
That's a great way to put it.
We can never pull it off to see the true face underneath. But Sartre looks at this and says, no, that's completely wrong. The appearance is the essence.
Yes.
There is no secret reality hiding behind the phenomenon.
He calls this the monism of the phenomenon. It's this radical flattening of reality. Sartre argues that an object is nothing more than the infinite series of its appearances.
So there's no hidden depth.
Right. If you look at a table, there isn't a magical table essence hiding in some invisible dimension. The table is exactly the sum of every possible angle you could view it from, every way it can be touched, used, or perceived.
Okay.
The appearance doesn't hide the essence. It reveals it.
That seems almost like a relief, honestly. Reality isn't playing a trick on us.
Exactly.
But to establish this, to make this claim that the world is exactly as it presents itself, Sartre has to completely overhaul how we understand the thing doing the perceiving.
He does. He has to overhaul consciousness.
Right. And this brings us to his massive critique of René Descartes. I mean, everyone knows Descartes' famous maxim, right? I think, therefore I am.
Oh, yeah. Cogito ergo sum.
Descartes essentially said that the act of reflecting, of thinking about oneself thinking, is the absolute bedrock, the foundation of all existence and certainty.
Descartes believed that the conscious I is a substance, a solid thing that exists independently. But Sartre pushes back hard against this.
He really goes after him.
He does. He argues that Cartesian reflection, this act of sitting down, turning your mental gaze inward, and saying, I am thinking, it's actually a secondary act.
Interesting.
It's a derived state, not the original state.
So if I'm understanding this, Sartre is saying Descartes is starting one step too late. The I think is already a complication of something simpler.
That's a brilliant way to frame it.
Yeah.
Descartes misses the original layer entirely. Sartre introduces what he calls the pre-reflective cogito.
Okay.
He argues that the primary original state of consciousness is non-positional and non-synthetic.
Oof. Okay, we're hitting some heavy philosophical jargon there. Non-positional and non-pathetic. Let's translate that for everyone.
Right, sorry. It simply means that original consciousness does not posit itself as an object. It doesn't point at itself.
Got it.
It is an awareness of the world before the ego or the I steps in to reflect on it. For Sartre, consciousness is always, by definition, consciousness of something. It is always directed outward.
So it's like a spotlight.
Exactly. When you are deeply engaged in the world, consciousness is entirely aimed at the objects in the world, not inward at yourself.
There's a really fascinating deep dive into this exact concept in our research stack. Yue Zheng's article looks closely at Sartre's concept of pure reflection.
Zheng's work is incredibly helpful here.
It is. Zheng points out that scholars often gloss over this methodological stuff to get to the juicy, dramatic ethics of Sartre's work. But you can't understand the ethics without this.
No, you really can't.
Zheng contrasts Sartre with Edmund Husserl, who was Sartre's major influence in phenomenology.
Husserl is the pioneer here. He developed a method called the Phenomenological Ontology, or bracketing.
Right, and bracketing is essentially a thought experiment. Husserl says, let's put the existence of the outside world in brackets.
To suspend our belief in it entirely.
Yeah, like whether the tree I'm looking at actually exists in physical reality doesn't matter for a moment. What matters is my conscious experience of the tree.
Right.
Husserl wanted to retreat into the realm of reconstructed consciousness to find what he called apodictic evidence, basically absolute, unshakable certainty.
But Sartre rejects this retreat into an inner sanctum of the mind. He says we don't need to reconstruct consciousness in some sterile, bracketed mental laboratory to find certainty.
Because it's already there.
Exactly. The certainty is already there, out in the world, in the immediate, non-cognitive self-presence of consciousness.
And Zhang develops a brilliant, incredibly relatable way to explain this using what he calls the present tense feel account.
I love this concept.
It's so good. This non-positional, pre-reflective consciousness isn't an intellectual thought. It's not a sentence in your head. It's a feel.
Yeah.
And just to be clear, Zhang isn't talking about a physical sensation like touching a hot stove or an emotional state like feeling sad. He means the continuous non-linguistic awareness of an ongoing project.
Let's ground this. How does Zheng's feel actually operate in daily life?
Think about walking. Imagine you are just walking to the store. You know the route. You're deeply absorbed in the act of getting there.
Right.
There is no voice in your head saying, I, the ego, am now lifting my left foot, shifting my center of gravity, and placing it on the concrete.
If you did that, you'd never get there.
Exactly. There is no I present at all. There's just the continuous feel of the movement, the awareness of the destination, the sidewalk unfolding in front of you.
The consciousness is entirely out there on the sidewalk,
Yeah.
directed at the goal.
Exactly. The ego that Descartes was so obsessed with only appears when you suddenly step back and reflect.
Yes.
Let's say the sidewalk is uneven and you stumble. Suddenly, the spell is broken. You become aware of yourself. You think, wow, I almost fell. My foot hit that crack.
It pulls you right out of the flow.
And the funny thing is, once you start thinking about your feet walking, once the I gets involved, you usually trip. The reflection disrupts the pure action.
That is a phenomenal analogy. When you are absorbed in walking or reading a dripping novel or playing a fast-paced sport, you are not living as an I.
You're just doing it.
You are the feel of the intensity of the game or the story. Jung notes that these feels are continuous and non-linguistic. But positional consciousness, when you stop, step back, and reflect on yourself, is instantaneous, disjointed, and usually linguistic.
So what Sartre is doing here is radically democratizing consciousness. He is taking the I, the ego, out of the driver's seat of the mind.
He's entirely displacing it.
He says the ego isn't the thing doing the thinking. The ego isn't a homunculus pulling levers behind your eyes. It is just another object that consciousness can look at exactly the same way it looks at a tree or a chair or a crack in the sidewalk.
It is a monumental shift in Western philosophy. He has exiled the ego from the core of consciousness.
Wow.
And by making the ego an object in the world rather than the hidden director of the mind, Sartre claims to solve one of philosophy's most terrifying problems, which is solipsism.
Solipsism being that absolute paralyzing anxiety that maybe only your own mind is sure to exist and everything and everyone else is just a hallucination or a projection.
It's the ultimate loneliness.
Yeah.
Descartes' method inevitably leads to the threat of solipsism. If the only thing you can be absolutely certain of is your own internal I, then bridging the gap to prove that other minds exist becomes incredibly difficult.
Because you're trapped in your own head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Sartre says, wait, if your own I is just an object out there in the world, encountered by your pre-reflective consciousness in the exact same way you encounter other people's eyes, then the playing field is leveled.
Oh, I see.
Your own existence as a defined personality is no more or less certain than the existence of the people around you. You discover yourself out in the world alongside others.
That is entirely mind-bending, but it creates a massive vacuum, right?
How so?
If consciousness isn't a solid ego, if it isn't a personality or a soul sitting in a control room, if it's just this outward-directed awareness, what exactly is it? How do we define its existence?
Right.
And that question forces us to dive into the deep end of Sartre's core ontology, where he divides the entire universe into two radically distinct opposing modes of being.
This is the absolute bedrock of being and nothingness. The two modes are the in itself and the for itself.
In French, the en-soi and the pour-soi.
Exactly. Let's start with the easier of the two, being in itself. This is the realm of unconscious being. It is the rock, the table, the tree, the mountain.
Sartre's descriptions of the in itself are almost claustrophobic when you read them. He calls it massive, full positivity.
Yes.
It is uncreated, meaning it doesn't owe its existence to anything else. It has no reason for being, no underlying purpose. It has no connection with anything else. It is completely isolated in its own density. It simply is.
It is fully 100% identical with itself. There's a famous phrase from his earlier novel, Nausea, where the protagonist is looking at the root of a chestnut tree.
Oh, right, the root.
He suddenly realizes the raw, unfiltered existence of the root, and he describes it as de trop, superfluous, gratuitous.
Okay.
Right. The in itself is an obscene superfluity of existence that just sits there, taking up space, completely unjustifiable.
It has no past, because the past requires memory.
Exactly.
And it has no future, because the future requires anticipation. It is just an infinite, solid block of present reality.
Just an infinite density of being, no gaps, no meaning, no empty space.
But then, on the other side of the ledger, we have the for itself, and this is human consciousness.
This is where Sartre's thought becomes incredibly radical.
Yeah, and where the title of the book comes from, the for itself is not a substance. It's not a lighter, more ethereal kind of in itself. Sartre describes it as a decompression of being, a fissure or literally a hole in being.
A literal hole in being.
It is defined entirely by what it is not.
We have to be very precise here, because Sartre is not using nothingness as a poetic metaphor for feeling sad or empty.
Right, it's not mood.
No, he is positing nothingness as the active driving engine of human existence. Think about it logically. The in itself is everything that objectively exists.
Yeah.
It is total fullness. Therefore, if consciousness is going to be able to stand back and look at the in itself, to judge it, to be aware of it, consciousness cannot be the in itself.
Because if it were full, it would just be another rock.
Exactly. To have perspective, it must be a distance, a separation, must be a literal nothingness.
So without human consciousness, the universe is just a meaningless, undifferentiated mass of matter pressing up against itself.
Correct.
We are the ones who bring nothingness into the world. And that nothingness, that empty space we carry around, is what allows for differentiation, for meaning, for questions, and for lack.
It is a stunning reversal of how we normally think about existence. We usually think of existence as a positive addition to the universe. Sartre says human consciousness is a subtraction.
The research stack has a brilliant historical comparison to help us grasp the magnitude of this shift.
Oh, King Ho Loon's article.
Yes, King Ho Loon. The article looks at Sartre's nothingness through the lens of medieval scholastic theology.
It's a fascinating angle.
It really is. If we rewind to the Middle Ages, to a thinker like Thomas Aquinas, you had this dominant concept of transcendentals.
Transcendentals were considered the universal properties of all being. Things like oneness, truth, goodness, beauty.
Okay.
The medieval theologians argued that these properties existed in everything that had being, to varying degrees. And for Aquinas, these transcendentals were essentially the fingerprints of God.
Because God is absolute goodness and absolute truth.
Right. So the fact that a tree or a rock possesses some trace of goodness or truth points back to the Creator. They prove God's omnipresence.
So existence itself was proof of divine positivity. Everything that exists is good in some way.
Yes.
But Sartre takes this entire theological framework and just flips it upside down.
Completely. De Jong points out that Sartre borrows a famous maxim from Baruch Spinoza. Omnis determinatio est negatio. All determination is negation.
Okay, I'm struggling with that a bit. All determination is negation. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means that to define what something is, you fundamentally have to define what it is not.
Give me an example.
Sure. To say this object is a table is simultaneously to say it is not a chair, it is not the floor, it is not a tree. Its identity relies on drawing a boundary of negation around it.
Ah, okay. So you can't have a specific determinate thing without a negative boundary separating it from everything else.
Exactly. So for Sartre, the universal predicate of everything in the world, the thing that applies to absolutely everything we encounter, isn't God's goodness or truth.
It's the not.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is the not. Every determinate thing is defined by negation. Thus, Leung argues, Sartre elevates nothingness to the status of an atheistic transcendental.
That is wild, where the medieval thinkers looked at the structure of reality and sought the omnipresence of God holding it all together. Sartre looks at the exact same structure of reality, the way things are defined and separated, and sees a universal architecture that signifies the absolute structural absence of God.
And we must remember, this isn't just a high-level abstract logic puzzle for Sartre. This ontology of nothingness is something we experience viscerally every single day.
Oh, absolutely.
Sartre coins a term for these experiences, negatites. He calls them ultramundane beings of absence.
Let's do a thought experiment to make this real for you listening right now. Imagine looking into your wallet. You are absolutely 100% expecting to find a crisp $100 bill that you put there yesterday.
Okay, we've all been there.
Right. So you open it up, and there is only a $20 bill. When you look inside that wallet, you do not just see a piece of paper with a 20 on it. You vividly, tangibly experience the active lack of the $80.
The absence hits you like a physical force.
Yes.
Yeah.
That absence is a real thing in your conscious experience. It has weight, but, and this is the crucial part, that lack, that negative reality, only exists because of human expectation.
Right.
If a dog looked in the wallet, it wouldn't see an absence of $80. It would just see green paper and smell old leather.
Because the dog only perceives the in itself. The dog perceives the positive reality of what is physically there. The human, however, brings their for itself, their nothingness, into the situation. The human projects an expectation of $100, and when reality doesn't match the projection, the human perceives the nothingness.
Sartre has a very famous, very literary example of this in the book. He talks about arriving late to a cafe to meet his friend Pierre.
I love this example.
It's so cinematic. When Sartre walks in and looks at the cafe, he doesn't just see a room full of patrons, waiters, tables, and smoke. Because he is actively looking for Pierre, All of those positive objects, the tables, the people, recede into the background. They become a flat canvas.
Just a blur.
Yeah, and what stands out against that canvas as a sharp, shimmering reality is the absence of Pierre. Pierre's not being there is the most real thing in the room to Sartre in that moment. And Sartre brought that absence into the world through his conscious project.
Richard Aquila's article in our sources takes this analysis of nothingness even further, breaking it down into two distinct philosophical problems.
Okay, let's hear it.
Aquila points out that when we talk about the nothingness of the for itself, we have to distinguish between the non-being of a state of consciousness and the non-being of a human person.
That sounds like splitting hairs. Why is that distinction important?
Because it clarifies what Sartre actually means. Aquila argues that when Sartre says a state of consciousness is a nothing, he doesn't mean it's a magical, invisible ghost stuff.
Right, it's not a soul.
No. He means that a state of consciousness is a state of affairs involving an object and nothing else besides. It's not a particular thing, it's a pure relation.
Okay, so a state of affairs is like saying the book is on the table. The book is a thing, the table is a thing, but the being on isn't a third physical thing you can put in a jar. It's just the relation between them.
Precisely. A negative state of affairs like Pierre's absence from the cafe requires an ontological grounding in consciousness to exist.
Right.
But, Aquila points out, the non-being of persons is a slightly different claim. When Sartre says a person's being is a non-being, he is saying that personal existence cannot be captured as an objective fact. You can never define a person as a fixed, complete remuneration.
In itself.
Because we are always moving. We are continuous projection toward the future.
Yes. Aquila illustrates this using the character Hugo from Sartre's play, Dirty Hands.
Oh, that's a great play.
It is. Hugo is a young intellectual who commits a political murder. Throughout the play, Hugo agonizes over the meaning of his act. Was it a deliberate, meaningful ideological assassination? Or was it just an empty, jealous spasm of behavior because he thought the victim was sleeping with his wife?
He wants to know what the objective reality of his action is.
But the existential resolution is that the action has no objective existence apart from the judgments and future projects Hugo chooses to apply to it.
He has to decide.
Yes, he has to decide what the murder meant by how he lives the rest of his life. His being is not a fixed fact. It is something he has to continuously create. Which brings us perfectly to the next major pillar of his thought. The burden of freedom and the paradox of situational choices.
This is where it gets really intense.
Yeah, because human consciousness is this nothingness, this pure relation. It is not tied down by the solid, deterministic chain of cause and effect that governs the physical world. This emptiness, this void inside us, is the exact source of our absolute, inescapable freedom.
It is vital for anyone reading Sartre to understand that he defines freedom very differently than we do in colloquial speech.
Definitely.
We often confuse freedom with power or political liberty or just the ability to obtain whatever we want. For Sartre, freedom is strictly ontological. It is the structural capacity of consciousness to secrete a nothingness between yourself and your past, and between yourself and your environment.
Secrete a nothingness. That's a strange phrase.
It means that you are fundamentally separated from what you were a moment ago. You are not your past. The person you were 10 minutes ago, the choices you made yesterday, those are now facts. They're part of the in itself. They are frozen. But your current consciousness is separated from that frozen past by a veil of nothingness.
The past does not dictate the present.
Therefore, you perpetually have to make yourself from scratch in every single moment. Sartre famously says, man is condemned to be free.
Condemned. That's a heavy word, and I have to push back here because this is a point where Sartre always frustrates people, including me.
Let's hear it.
Let's use an extreme example. Let's say I am unjustly arrested and thrown into a prison cell. I am locked in solitary confinement. I didn't choose the cell. The stone walls are physically real. The iron door is locked. The guards have guns. I have zero power.
Right.
How on earth can Sartre look at a prisoner in solitary confinement and say, you are absolutely free?
It's the classic objection, and it's one Sartre anticipated. Eric Tremolle's article in our sources does an excellent job of unpacking this specific paradox. Sartre clarifies the vital distinction between the freedom to choose or wish and the freedom to obtain.
Okay, so he concedes the prisoner isn't free to just walk out the door.
Of course. Sartre is not delusional about physical reality. He introduces the concept of facticity.
Facticity.
Facticity comprises the hard, unchangeable facts of your situation. Your physical body, your past, the historical era you were born into, and yes, the stone walls of a prison cell.
the things you're just thrown into.
Yes, you do not choose your facticity. Sartre says there is freedom only in a situation, and there is a situation only through freedom.
I need you to break that quote down. How does the prisoner's freedom create the situation of the prison?
The physical walls exist as in itself. They are just dense matter. But they only become a prison. They only take on a specific meaning through the free choice of the prisoner's attitude and goals.
Right.
The prisoner did not choose the walls, but the prisoner is absolutely free to choose how to orient their consciousness toward those walls.
So if the prisoner's fundamental choice, their project, is to escape and return to their family, the walls reveal themselves as a terrifying, agonizing obstacle.
Yes. The freedom to desire escape is what makes the wall an obstacle. But what if the prisoner chooses a different project? What if the prisoner, perhaps a monk or a political martyr, chooses to view the cell as an opportunity for spiritual retreat or a symbol of their ideological purity?
Then the wall isn't an obstacle anymore.
Exactly.
It's a shelter. It's a tool for their martyrdom. The physical atoms of the wall haven't changed, but its meaning in the universe has been completely rewritten by the prisoner's free choice of a goal.
Exactly. This is what Néant highlights about Sartre's paradox. The physical world undeniably limits us, but it only limits us in relation to the goals we freely set.
The sources mention a really helpful concept from Sartre's earlier work, The Emotions, called the Ontological map.
Such a great concept.
It sounds complicated, but it's basically the idea that the world appears to us as a network of pathways, obstacles, and tools based entirely on what we're trying to achieve.
A landscape isn't neutral.
Right. Think of a massive, snow-capped mountain. If my freely chosen goal is to climb to the summit, that mountain appears on my mental map as a grueling, dangerous obstacle.
Yeah.
But if my freely chosen goal is to sit in the valley and paint a landscape, the mountain isn't an obstacle at all. It's a beautiful subject.
The mountain doesn't have an inherent meaning.
Exactly. Its meaning is secreted by my freedom, by what I want to do with it.
It's a powerful framework. But Néant also points out a significant theoretical tension in Sartre's official conception of phenomena here.
What's the tension?
If consciousness is a pure nothingness, a pure freedom that negates being, then the original being it negates can't just be a transphenomenal void. It has to be something concrete.
Meaning freedom has to have a physical anchor somewhere, or else we are just floating ghosts.
Exactly. Néant argues that Sartre implicitly developed an alternative conception throughout the text, where the initial situation is intimately tied to our bodily affectivity. The technical term he uses is co-anesthesia.
Whoa, back up. Co-anesthesia. Break that down for me.
Co-anesthesia is the general background feeling of your own body from the inside. It's the hum of your nervous system, the awareness of your own weight, the vague feeling of fatigue or vitality.
Ah, okay.
The bodily effect that you don't usually pay attention to unless you're sick.
Like the static on a television screen, just the baseline reality of having meat and bones.
Yes. Néant suggests that for Sartre, this baseline bodily feeling is the ultimate anchor of our absolute freedom. Our freedom isn't a detached intellectual exercise. It is an embodied negation.
We feel
We experience our freedom through the constraints and sensations of our physical form.
which grounds the philosophy beautifully, but it doesn't remove the psychological terror of it.
No, not at all.
If everything I value, my career, my morality, my relationships, only has value because I arbitrarily chose to give it value, that leads to a staggering sense of meaninglessness, which is exactly what Guido Landau's article tackles.
Sartre is quite blunt about this. He argues that because our foundational choices, our original projects, have no external justification, no God ordaining them, no objective moral universe backing them up, life is essentially absurd.
We are a foundationless foundation.
Yes, we hold the world up, but nothing is holding us up.
It's the ultimate existential vertigo. You look down and there is no floor. But Landau pushes back on Sartre here, and I found his argument incredibly refreshing.
Landau's critique is fascinating because he accepts Sartre's core premise. He agrees that our freedom is undetermined, and therefore our values lack objective, external, cosmic justification.
Right.
But Landau asks a brilliant question. Why must we feel guilty or despairing about this subjectivism?
Right. Sartre frames this lack of foundation as a tragedy. He calls it a useless passion.
Yeah.
But Landau points out that Sartre seems to harbor a hidden, unchosen meta-value. Sartre implicitly assumes that values are only good or legitimate if they are objectively confirmed by the universe.
Which is a hangover from the very religious and traditional philosophical systems Sartre claims to have escaped. Landau says, why can't we be proud subjectivists?
Exactly. If we are entirely free to choose our values, we can freely choose to accept that our values are self-justifying axioms. We don't have to view our foundationless freedom as a tragedy.
We can just own it.
We can say, yes, my love for my family has no cosmic objective weight. The universe doesn't care, but I care, and my choice is enough to sustain it. We can just own it.
We can own it, yes. But philosophically and psychologically, that is incredibly difficult to sustain. The demand to be the sole author of your universe without any external validation is an immense cognitive load.
In fact, it's so hard that almost all of us spend the vast majority of our lives running away from it.
Oh, constantly.
And that brings us to one of the most famous and most applicable concepts in all of existentialism, the flight from freedom, and what Sartre calls bad faith.
When a human being genuinely confronts this radical freedom, the realization that there are no excuses, no human nature to blame things on, no destiny, it causes a profound psychological reaction that Sartre calls anguish.
And we should clarify, anguish is not the same as fear. Right.
Crucial distinction. Fear is directed at an external object. You are afraid of a bear in the woods. You are afraid of a ticking bomb.
Right.
Anguish is directed inward. Anguish is the fear of yourself. It is the realization of your own unpredictability.
Like when you are standing on the edge of a cliff, fear is the worry that the rock might crumble and you'll fall. Anguish is the sudden, horrifying realization that there is absolutely nothing preventing you from choosing to jump.
Yes.
You are terrified of your own freedom to do the unthinkable.
Precisely. And because living in a constant state of anguish is unbearable, we develop highly sophisticated, semi-conscious psychological mechanisms to lie to ourselves.
We trick ourselves.
We try to hide from our freedom. This is mauvaise foi, or bad faith.
How does it work mechanically?
Bad faith is an attempt to freeze the self. You do this by oscillating between two extremes. You either pretend to be a pure object, and in itself, driven entirely by determinism, biology, or social roles, denying that you have any choice.
Okay.
Or, conversely, you pretend to be pure freedom, completely detached from your physical reality, your past, and your factual constraints, denying your facticity.
Let's use Sartre's famous examples because he was a novelist as well as a philosopher, and his vignettes bring this to life perfectly. First, the waiter in the cafe.
Ah, the waiter. The waiter is the quintessential example of denying one's freedom to pretend to be an object. Sartre was sitting in a cafe observing a waiter, and he notices that the waiter is acting a little too much like a waiter.
His movements are too eager, his voice is too solicitous, he balances his tray with the rigid, jerky precision of an automaton. He's putting on a performance.
The waiter is playing at being a waiter. He is trying to convince himself and everyone around him that his absolute essence is waiter.
He wants to be a thing.
He wants to believe that he is a thing, in itself, completely determined by his economic role. He wants to say, I am a waiter the way a rock is a rock. I have no choice in how I behave.
Because if he admits he is for itself a conscious nothingness that is totally free, then he has to face the terrifying anguish that he could, at any moment, just drop the tray, smash the glasses, and walk out the door.
Playing the robot is safer than facing the void.
And the second classic example goes in the other direction. It is the woman on a first date.
This one is incredibly nuanced.
She knows the man she is with desires her, and she knows that sooner or later she will have to make a decision about his advances. But she wants to delay the moment of decision. She wants to enjoy the intellectual flattery and the charm without confronting the crude sexual reality of the situation.
So they're talking, and the man reaches across the table and takes her hand.
This is the moment of crisis. If she pulls her hand away, she ruins the pleasant, flattering atmosphere. If she squeezes his hand back, she commits to the sexual reality of the date. So what does she do to avoid making a choice?
What does she do?
She leaves her hand completely inert, limp in his. She continues talking about high-minded intellectual topics as if nothing has happened.
She mentally detaches from her body. She pretends that she is pure spirit, pure transcendent consciousness, and that the physical hand resting in the man's hand is just a fleshy object that has nothing to do with her true self.
She is denying her facticity. She is denying her physical, situated presence in the world to avoid the freedom of having to make a choice. Both the waiter and the woman are in bad faith. They are lying to themselves about the nature of their own being.
Carol Haynes Curtis has a fascinating article in our stack that digs into the mechanics of this self-deception.
Well, yeah, the belief versus knowledge piece.
She looks specifically at the faith part of bad faith. She argues that readers often get too caught up in the bad aspect, judging it as a moral failing, and ignore how the epistemological mechanism of faith actually works.
Haynes Curtis makes a brilliant point about Sartre's distinction between belief and knowledge.
It's a subtle but huge difference.
When you are operating in good faith, you believe something like, I believe Pierre is my friend, or I believe I am a brave person, but you don't commit to it as absolute, unshakable scientific knowledge. Belief inherently leaves room for doubt. It acknowledges its own fragility.
But bad faith exploits this very loophole of belief.
How so?
Because belief lacks absolute certainty, it requires no final commitment. You can choose to believe something precisely because the evidence isn't total. Haynes Curtis uses a clinical psychological case study that Sartre himself discusses the case of a frigid woman, originally documented by the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Steckel.
This is a complex example. Walk us through it.
In this case, the woman physically experiences sexual pleasure. Her physiological responses are an objective fact of her facticity, but she deliberately distracts her consciousness from it in the moment. She chooses to believe she is frigid.
Why would she do that?
She does this to avoid the implications of her sexuality, perhaps out of trauma or societal shame.
So she knows, on some level, that her body is responding, but she chooses to elevate the belief of her frigidity above the physical evidence.
Because she chooses to hold her state as a mere belief rather than accepting it as factual knowledge, she keeps an escape hatch open. She avoids taking responsibility for her physical reality. Bad faith is the deliberate manipulation of the fragile nature of belief.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I want to take this out of 1940s Paris and bring it into the modern era.
Well, let's do it.
How do we apply bad faith to modern social interactions? Think about how we use digital avatars, algorithmic labels, or even psychological personality tests today.
It is arguably more prevalent now than ever.
Right. Someone takes a Myers-Briggs test online, gets a result, and says to their friends, I can't go to the networking party tonight. I'm an INTJ. I'm literally biologically wired as an introvert. I can't help it. It's just who I am.
That is the modern equivalent of the waiter in the cafe.
Exactly. We use these psychological labels or astrological signs or algorithmic profiles to freeze ourselves into it in itself. We build a comfortable, scientific-sounding cage of data and say, look, this is my essence.
And we do it purely to avoid the terrifying responsibility of our for itself.
Right. Our freedom to act differently, to push past our discomfort, to change, to be unpredictable.
We weaponize labels against our own freedom by defining ourselves as algorithmic outputs or fixed personality types. We abdicate the responsibility of choosing our behavior in the present moment. We treat ourselves as objects in a determined universe, which is the very essence of bad faith.
But bad faith isn't just an internal monologue. It isn't just something we do in isolation. We are constantly colliding with other people who are also trying to navigate their own freedom.
It gets messy.
And that brings us to the next massive complication in Sartre's philosophy: the look, alienation, and being for others. We don't just struggle with ourselves. The sheer existence of other consciousnesses disrupts our world.
Indeed. We've talked extensively about the in-itself objects and the for-itself consciousness.
Yeah.
Now we introduce a third, unavoidable ontological dimension: being for others.
Okay.
And Sartre illustrates this with perhaps the most famous and visceral vignette in the entire book: the voyeur at the keyhole.
Okay, picture this. You are in a hotel hallway. You are kneeling down in the dark, peeking through a keyhole into someone else's room, listening to a private conversation.
Right.
You are entirely, completely absorbed in the act. You are in that pre-reflective state we discussed earlier.
There is no I evaluating the situation. You aren't judging yourself.
Right. There is just the feel of the scene behind the door, the intense curiosity. You are pure subjectivity. You are organizing the entire hallway, the door, and the keyhole around your project of spying. You are the master of the universe.
Until.
But suddenly you hear floorboards creak behind you. Someone is walking down the hall.
Instantly, radically, everything changes. The voyeur realizes they're being watched. They're caught.
It's the worst feeling.
In that split second, they experience a profound, paralyzing rush of shame. But ontologically, Sartre asks, what has actually happened here? It is a catastrophe for the voyeur's freedom. The look of the other has transformed the voyeur from a pure, masterful subject into a vulnerable object.
You suddenly realize you have an outside, an exterior that the other person sees, categorizes, and judges. And here's the truly terrifying part. You can never fully access or control that outside.
Never.
You don't know exactly what you look like to them. The other person now holds a piece of your being, and they can do whatever they want with it.
Sartre is deeply dramatic about this. He calls the existence of the other our original fall.
Wow.
The moment you are seen, you fall from the grace of pure subjectivity into the alienated world of objects.
Luna Dolezal's article in our research stack breaks down this phenomenon of the sec. Look into 3 distinct layers, which I think clarifies a lot of the confusion surrounding Sartre's text.
It really does.
Sometimes people read this and think, well, I don't feel profound shame every time a barista looks at me.
Exactly. Dolezal says we need to separate the senses of the look. First, there's the epistemological case. This is the literal gathering of information.
Okay.
By being seen by others, we realize factual features about our physical body and space. We learn that we take up room, that we have a back that we cannot see. But Dolezal notes, this literal information gathering alone isn't enough to cause the profound alienation Sartre describes.
Right, so we move to the second layer, the self-evaluative case. This is where the emotional impact, the shame or the pride comes in.
Yes.
You adopt the other's viewpoint on yourself. You judge yourself as though you were looking through their eyes. The voyeur judges himself as a creep because that is what the other sees. And Sartre notes that even a false alarm, a floorboard creaking when no one is actually there, can trigger this internal self-evaluation.
And finally, the deepest layer, the ontological case. Dolezal argues that the look isn't fundamentally about literal peeping toms or social anxiety. It is a metaphorical illustration of the originary awakening of reflective self-consciousness.
Meaning we need the other to even have an ego in the first place.
Yes, we can only know ourselves, we can only form an identity through the mediation of the other. Without the other looking at us, we would just be unthematized, pre-reflective projects floating through the world.
Oh, wow.
The other forces us to form a public body image, to recognize ourselves as entities in a social world.
But because our identity relies on this alienating look, Sartre sees human relations as fundamentally conflictual. It is essentially a zero-sum game of power.
Always.
If the other's look makes me an object and steals my subjectivity, my only defense mechanism is to turn around and look right back at them, to objectify them and reclaim my status as the subject. It's an endless, hostile stare-down.
Which is why Sartre famously wrote in his play No Exit, Hell is Other People. He viewed all attempts at human connection, even the most intimate forms of love, as doomed projects.
That's so sick.
We are trying to capture the other's freedom without reducing them to an object, which is an ontological impossibility. If you love someone, you want them to freely choose you. But you also want to possess them completely as a secure, unchanging object.
You want a guarantee.
Yes. And because you can't have both freedom and a guarantee, love oscillates between sadism, trying to forcefully make the other person an object, and masochism, trying to make yourself a willing object for them to use.
I have to admit that is an incredibly bleak view of human relationships.
It is dark.
Is every single interaction really just a hostile stare-down? What about empathy? What about genuine care? Dolezal's article points out that other phenomenologists severely criticize Sartre on this exact point, notably Maurice Merleau-Ponty.
Merleau-Ponty's critique is very strong here. He argued that Sartre's hyper-focus on conflict completely ignores the reality of reciprocal, loving looks. Merleau-Ponty uses the example of the gaze between a mother and an infant.
Right. When a mother looks at her baby, that isn't an alienating, objectifying power struggle. It isn't a battle for subjectivity. It's mutual recognition. It's nurturing. The baby discovers its sense of self through the warmth of the mother's gaze, not through the terror of being caught at a keyhole.
If we look impartially at the debate between these two giants, Merleau-Ponty believes that intersubjectivity can be a space of shared meaning, bodily empathy, and mutual understanding. He believes we can exist in a we.
And Sartre.
Sartre, however, operating strictly within his ontological architecture of negation and nothingness, sees those moments of supposed harmony as fleeting illusions. For Sartre, the fundamental ontological structure is alienation. Love, for him, is a fragile truce where both parties agree to a mutual illusion, but it inevitably collapses back into the conflict of the look.
It's a dark view, but it perfectly sets up the underlying question of the whole book. If we're driven by the anguish of our own emptiness or nothingness, and we are constantly alienated and objectified by the look of the other, what is the ultimate goal?
What are we trying to do?
Right. What is consciousness actually trying to achieve in all this frantic striving, loving, and fighting?
To answer that, we have to return to the core nature of the for itself. We establish that consciousness is a nothingness, a void. Because it is a void, it is fundamentally a lack.
Sartre uses the analogy of a crescent moon. The crescent moon implies the rest of the moon. It is defined by the full moon that it is lacking.
Exactly. The for itself lacks completion. What consciousness wants, above all else, is a synthesis. It looks out at the in itself, the rock, the tree, the table, and sees stable, internal, justified existence.
Okay.
The rock doesn't suffer from anguish. It just is. Consciousness deeply wants that stability. It wants to be solid.
But it doesn't just want to be a rock, right? If it became a rock, it would lose its awareness, its freedom.
Right. It wants to retain its own conscious, free awareness, but it wants that awareness to be perfectly solid and justified. It wants to be conscious of its own perfect solidity.
It wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be the in itself for itself.
The in itself for itself. That is the impossible dream of human consciousness. And Stephen Wang's article, analyzing excerpts from the primary text, unpacks the theological implications of this brilliantly.
It's a great analysis.
This impossible synthesis, this perfectly complete yet fully conscious being, is precisely the traditional philosophical definition of God.
God as the causa sui, the cause of itself.
Yes, the being whose essence is to exist, who is perfectly complete, lacking nothing, yet fully conscious and totally free.
So Sartre is making a massive psychological and ontological claim here. He is saying that the fundamental underlying project of every single human being, whether they realize it or not, whether they're religious or staunchly atheist, is the desire to be God.
Yes.
Every time we seek wealth or love or artistic immortality, we are fundamentally trying to achieve the status of the in itself for itself. We want to be the secure foundation of our own being without losing our freedom.
But because this is a logical contradiction, you cannot mathematically be a solid block of being in an empty hole of nothingness. At the exact same time, Sartre reaches his most famous and perhaps most devastating conclusion about human nature. Man is a useless passion.
A useless passion. We are striving with every ounce of our energy for a goal that is mathematically, ontologically impossible to achieve.
We are a bridge that doesn't connect to the other side. But Wang draws a fascinating, deeply nuanced comparison here between Sartre and the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas.
I love this part.
This is where the intellectual architecture gets really interesting, and we must look at it impartially to understand how different worldviews operate.
Walk us through the comparison, because Sartre is the ultimate atheist and Aquinas is the ultimate theologian. How do they connect?
What is startling is that both Sartre and Aquinas agree perfectly on the phenomenological structure of the human condition. They both look at human beings and say, humans are constitutively incomplete. We are driven by an innate, unquenchable desire for a beyond, a completion that cannot possibly be satisfied by anything in this finite physical temporal life.
So they're looking at the exact same blueprint of the human soul. We are restless, incomplete, and chasing an impossible synthesis.
Precisely. They have the exact same diagnosis, but they take radically different exits off the same highway for their prognosis.
Okay, lay it out.
Sartre looks at this structure, sees that the synthesis is logically impossible in the physical world, and concludes that life is inherently absurd. The desire is a cruel joke of ontology.
And Aquinas.
Aquinas looks at the exact same structure of unquenchable desire and argues that the very fact we possess this inexhaustible desire for a completion beyond this life demonstrates that we must be oriented toward a fulfillment beyond death. For Aquinas, the unfulfillable nature of the desire in this world is evidence for the existence of an afterlife and a transcendent God that can fulfill it. Sartre uses the exact same map to prove the universe is absurd and God is a contradictory illusion.
It's amazing how two brilliant minds can agree so completely on the diagnosis of human longing, but offer completely opposing conclusions. We're not taking a side here, obviously, but seeing how they use the same structural map is wild.
It really is.
But this raises a huge question about humanity collectively. If we all have this impossible desire to be God, how do we deal with humanity as a whole? Because we don't just want individual completion, we often seek a sense of unity with others.
Sartre addresses this collective desire with the concept of the US object. We discussed earlier how the look of a single other turns me into an object and causes alienation.
Right, the keyhole.
Exactly. Sartre argues that the only way we can feel a true unified sense of human community, of solidarity, and us is if a third looks at all of us together, turning our entire group into a single object.
Let's use an analogy. Imagine a group of factory workers. They are arguing with each other, bickering over petty things. There is no solidarity. But suddenly, the ruthless factory owner, the third, walks onto the floor and glares at them.
Instantly, their individual conflicts vanish. Under the objectifying gaze of the boss, they feel a sudden, intense solidarity. They become the us being watched by the third. They are united in their shared objectification.
Yes, that makes perfect sense in a social context. But what about all of humanity?
That is where the ontology hits a wall. To feel a totalized, ultimate solidarity of the entire human race, we would require an absolute third to look at all of us simultaneously.
Okay.
And the ultimate, unrealizable third, who looks at all of humanity but cannot be looked at by anyone, is God.
So the idea of a unified humanity is completely tied to the idea of a watching God.
Exactly. And because God is an impossible, contradictory concept for Sartre, a true, enduring, peaceful human solidarity is also an unattainable illusion. We can only experience fleeting, localized moments of the U.S. object in specific social or class struggles, where one group acts as the third for another. But universal brotherhood is ontologically impossible.
Which feels incredibly relevant when we look at history and how easily human solidarity fractures the moment there isn't an external enemy to unite against.
Very true.
But this brings us to the final major theme we need to explore. Existential psychoanalysis, its impact, and the critical reception of the book. Having laid out this massive, tragic, but incredibly empowering architecture of thought, how did Sartre actually apply it to individual psychology?
Sartre developed a method he called existential psychoanalysis, and it was a direct, aggressive challenge to Sigmund Freud. Sartre completely rejected Freud's concept of the unconscious mind.
Which is a huge deal because the unconscious was the dominant psychological paradigm of the 20th century. Why does Sartre hate the idea of the unconscious?
Because it is the ultimate form of bad faith. If you have an unconscious mind, a hidden id, pulling the strings, harboring secret traumas that dictate your behavior without your knowledge, then you aren't truly free.
And if you aren't free, you aren't responsible.
Exactly. You can say, I couldn't help cheating on my spouse. It was my unconscious trauma acting out. Sartre says absolutely not. He insisted that all desires, all neuroses, all seemingly irrational behaviors are actually conscious.
But people clearly do things they don't consciously understand. I mean, we've all been there.
Sartre says they are pre-reflectively conscious. They are expressions of a person's original project, their unique, fundamental, but freely chosen way of relating to the world.
Okay.
So instead of digging for repressed childhood memories hidden in a shadowy realm of the mind, an existential psychoanalyst looks at your current, observable behaviors and preferences to decode the fundamental choice you have made about your existence.
And Sartre applied this method to some really strange things in the book. There is a whole section analyzing the concept of the slimy or the viscous.
Oh, yes. The analysis of the slimy is one of the most famous and peculiar parts of Being and Nothingness. He asks a simple question. Why do humans, almost universally, find slimy things like mucus or a slug or thick mud repulsive?
A biologist would say it's an evolutionary adaptation to avoid disease.
But Sartre says it's ontological. Slime is the physical manifestation of the in itself threatening to absorb the for of itself. Think about the physical properties of slime.
It's gross.
Well, it isn't solid, but it isn't liquid either. It's sticky. It clings to you. It slows you down. It threatens to dissolve your fast-moving, free consciousness into a gooey, undifferentiated mass. Fear of the slimy is the existential fear of losing your conscious nothingness and being swallowed by the innocent self.
That is an incredibly creative, albeit bizarre, way to look at the world. But it brings us to how the intellectual world reacted to this 700-page manifesto. What was the critical reception? Because reading it, as we've seen, is a massive undertaking.
The reception was appropriately explosive, but highly mixed among professional philosophers. Our sources highlight several key reviews that pinpoint the strengths and weaknesses of the text. For instance, Frederick Olofsson praises the sheer scope of the ontology, acknowledging it as a towering achievement. But he sharply criticizes Sartre's writing style.
What was Olofsson's specific complaint?
Olofsson takes issue with Sartre's reliance on what he calls a burst of metaphors. Sartre constantly describes consciousness using poetic, dramatic imagery.
Right.
He calls it a crevice, a mirror, a fissure, or a worm coiled in the heart of being.
I mean, they sound great in a novel.
Exactly. But Olofsson argues that while these are beautiful literary devices, they are virtually useless for rigorous logical understanding. They obscure rather than clarify the philosophical mechanics.
Yeah.
When you try to nail down exactly how a worm coiled in being functions as a logical premise, the argument often falls apart.
Then we have Carlton Berenda, who reviewed the book from the perspective of a biologist and philosopher of science.
Berenda noted that while the book is basically peripheral to hard physical science, Sartre wasn't trying to do physics. It was absolutely vital for 20th century psychology.
Why?
Because, as we discussed, it replaces those mysterious mythological Freudian forces with sheer, undeniable conscious responsibility. Berenda appreciated that Sartre made emotion an active choice.
An active choice.
Yeah, for Sartre, an emotion like sudden anger isn't a physiological wave that sweeps over you helplessly. It's a magical transformation of the world that you actively choose to engage in when the physical pathways to your goal are blocked.
Oh, wow.
You choose to be angry to change this situation. Berenda saw this as a massive step forward for psychological accountability.
Finally, we have Radar Du's piece on self-knowledge and moral properties. Du points out a profound, almost unresolvable tension in Sartre's work regarding morality.
This is the crux of the existential dilemma. Du points out that Sartre operates as a direct empirical realist, meaning he believes we are in direct contact with the real world prior to reflection. Yet Sartre simultaneously demands a very strong moral realism from his readers.
Yeah.
He wants us to be politically engaged, to fight against oppression, to take responsibility for the world.
But here's the tension. If freedom is absolute, if there are no objective values, and if my consciousness is fundamentally a nothingness, how can I be held morally accountable for anything? If I am nothing and values are arbitrary, why shouldn't I just be a selfish monster?
And Sartre's answer, which is brilliant but demanding, is that you are accountable precisely because you are nothing.
Because there's nothing else to blame.
Exactly. Because there is no human nature, no God, no deterministic biology to blame your actions on. You own absolutely everything you do. You cannot say, the devil made me do it, or my genetics made me do it. You are the sole author of your world, and therefore you bear the entire weight of it on your shoulders.
It is a philosophy that strips away every single excuse.
It is deeply tragic in its declaration that man is a useless passion, yet it is profoundly empowering in its insistence that we are the undisputed, absolute masters of our own meaning.
So after navigating this dense forest of nothingness, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's take a moment to recap this incredible journey. We started by dismantling the idea of a solid ego, exploring the pre-reflective cogito, the continuous feel of experience before we step back to judge ourselves.
Right.
We saw how human consciousness isn't a thing, but a decompression of being, a literal nothingness that brings meaning, differentiation, and the capacity for lack into a solid, meaningless universe. We explored the terrifying burden of radical freedom, how we use bad faith and labels to hide from that freedom, and how the look of the other alienates us and turns us into objects. And finally, we saw how all human striving, according to Sartre, is fundamentally the impossible desire to be the in itself for itself, the useless passion to be God.
It requires a fundamental rewiring of how you view your own life, your choices, in your relationships.
And that leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we end this deep dive. For Sartre, the past isn't in itself. It's a frozen block of being that our consciousness is separated from by a veil of nothingness.
Right.
That separation, that ability to leave the past behind is exactly what makes us free to change. But think about our modern digital age. Think about the internet.
We are recording everything.
Every text you send, every photo you take, every GPS location you visit, every embarrassing mistake you made a decade ago, it is all perfectly recorded in the cloud. It doesn't fade. Are we and our modern technological obsession effectively building a terrifyingly permanent, inescapable in itself out of our lives? By trying to immortalize every moment in data, are we trying to achieve that impossible in itself for itself? And by doing so, by building an indelible digital past that we can never truly leave behind, do we risk erasing the very nothingness, the very distance from our past that Sartre says makes us truly free?
If we leave no room for the void, if we leave no room for the past to fade away into nothingness, we leave no room for freedom.
Yeah.
We trap ourselves in our own data.
Exactly. Something to think about the next time you post your life online. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into being and nothingness. Keep questioning the world, keep exploring the terrifying, beautiful freedom of your own consciousness, and never be afraid of the nothingness. See you next time.